The evening sky was painted with soft shades of orange and gold as the man walked down the quiet street toward his home. It had been a long day filled with meetings, phone calls, and decisions that demanded his focus. All he wanted now was the comfort of his own home, the place where he could finally loosen his tie, rest his mind, and enjoy a quiet dinner. His neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where families waved at each other from porches and children rode their bikes freely on the sidewalks. He had chosen this home for peace, a space where he could breathe after the heavy responsibilities that filled his days. As he approached his driveway, he noticed a police car parked just a few feet away. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police cars were not unusual sights in any community. Maybe the officers were just patrolling or checking something nearby. He carried on walking, his briefcase in hand, ready to open the front gate. But before he could take another step, he heard a sharp voice call out to him. "Excuse me, sir. Can we ask what you're doing here?" He turned and saw two officers stepping out of the vehicle, their eyes fixed on him. The question caught him off guard, but he kept his calm. He smiled politely and answered, "I live here. I'm just heading inside." The officers exchanged quick looks, the kind that spoke louder than words. Instead of easing, their suspicion grew. One of them stepped closer, his hand resting near his belt, and asked again, "You live here? Are you sure about that?" The man raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. "Yes," he said simply. "This is my house." He pointed toward the front porch where the light above the door was glowing warmly, as if to welcome him home. But the officers didn't even glance in that direction. Their eyes stayed on him, measuring, doubting. "What's your name?" the second officer demanded. He gave his full name without hesitation. It was a name that carried weight in certain circles, but he knew that to them, in this moment, it meant nothing. He could already sense where this was going. "Do you have any ID on you?" one officer asked firmly. The man sighed softly. He knew he had his wallet in his jacket pocket. But he also knew that showing it wouldn't change what they had already decided in their minds. He had faced moments like this before, though never in a place where he thought he would feel safest, his own front yard. "I have my identification, yes," he replied calmly, "but I don't see why I should need to prove to you that I'm entering my own home." The officers didn't like that answer. Their eyes narrowed, and the one closest to him crossed his arms. "Because you look like you don't belong here," he said bluntly. "We've had reports of trespassers in this area. You're going to have to cooperate." The man felt a pang of frustration deep inside, but he didn't let it show. Years of discipline had trained him to keep his emotions in check. He knew very well that raising his voice or showing anger would only fuel their assumptions. Instead, he stood still, his expression calm, his voice even. "This is my property," he said firmly. "You're mistaken." By now, a few neighbors had noticed the commotion. Curtains were being pulled aside, and porch lights flicked on as people peeked out to see what was happening. A small group began gathering on the sidewalk, whispering to one another. Some had their phones out, recording quietly from a distance. The officers, however, seemed completely unaware of the growing audience. They were too focused on him. Their questions came one after another. Where was he coming from? Why was he here at this time? Did he have proof of ownership? Each time, he gave simple, steady answers. He never raised his tone, never lost control. But deep inside, he felt the sting of unfairness. He had spent his life working harder than most could imagine, earning respect across the nation, carrying responsibilities that few could shoulder. Yet here he was, being treated like a stranger on his own doorstep. The first officer finally stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "Look, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. Just show us your ID and we'll decide what happens next." The man looked at him for a long moment, studying the determination in his eyes. He realized that nothing he said would change the narrative they had already written about him in their minds. He knew this confrontation was far from over, but he also knew he had the patience to let it play out. As he stood there, under the dim glow of the streetlight, he thought of the irony. The very people who were sworn to protect citizens like him were now the ones making him feel unsafe, not because of anything he had done, but because of who they assumed he was. He tightened his grip on his briefcase, not in anger, but as a way of grounding himself. He took a slow breath, reminding himself that the truth always revealed itself in time. The officers waited, their hands tense, their posture rigid. He knew that in just a few moments, when he finally handed them his identification, their entire world would shift. But for now, he let the silence stretch between them, a silence heavy with misunderstanding, assumption, and the weight of a history he knew all too well. The neighbors watched, whispering louder now. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others gasped quietly. The man could sense their confusion. How could anyone not believe he belonged in his own home? And yet, this was the reality he faced. A reality where even the highest position in law enforcement could not shield him from the assumptions cast upon him by strangers in uniform. As the evening air grew cooler and the standoff continued, the man's patience remained his greatest strength. For in his calmness lay a quiet power, one that would soon transform this entire encounter into a lesson none of them would ever forget. The silence in the air grew heavier as the officers refused to step back. The man stood still, his calm voice echoing softly in the night. He had already said it more than once: this was his property, his home, the place where he had lived for years. Yet the two officers looked at him as though every word he spoke was a lie. Their expressions carried doubt, their tone carried authority, and their presence carried an unnecessary threat. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," the taller officer said firmly, his voice clipped and sharp. "Show us your ID and tell us exactly why you're here." The man sighed quietly and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He had no problem proving who he was. But what troubled him most was the fact that his word wasn't enough. His truth wasn't respected. His presence wasn't believed. It was as if the house behind him, the welcome mat by the door, the key in his pocket all meant nothing. To these officers, he was still an outsider. "I've already explained," he said evenly. "This is my house. I am not trespassing. I live here." The second officer chuckled under his breath, a laugh that carried no humor. "Funny," he muttered, "because you don't look like someone who owns a house like this." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't answer that insult. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, refusing to give them the reaction they were silently hoping for. He had seen this before. He had felt the sting of assumptions that came long before facts. He knew that responding with anger would only push the situation further toward danger. The taller officer took a step closer, lowering his voice but making his words sharp enough for everyone around to hear. "We've had complaints in this neighborhood. People trying to break into homes that don't belong to them. You fit the description. So don't play games with us." Neighbors began whispering louder now. Some of them shook their heads, some gasped quietly, while others lifted their phones a little higher to record every moment. The man knew that the scene unfolding in front of them would soon spread beyond this street. Cameras had a way of turning private injustices into public truths. He kept his voice calm, even softer this time. "The only thing I fit is the description of a man coming home after work. That's all." "You're mistaken." But his calmness only seemed to frustrate the officers. They expected fear, resistance, maybe even aggression. Instead, they were met with control, with dignity, with quiet strength. That, in their eyes, was defiance. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" the second officer asked, his tone now sharp with threat. "I'm refusing to be treated like a criminal in front of my own house," the man answered firmly. "That's what I'm refusing." The taller officer exchanged another look with his partner. Both of them seemed convinced they had caught someone in the act. Their voices grew louder, their words heavier with accusation. "Step away from the door," one barked. "Put your hands where I can see them," the other ordered. The man did neither. He simply stood there, his briefcase still in his hand, his posture tall, his presence steady. He looked at them with eyes that carried patience but also disappointment. The kind of look that came not from fear but from deep understanding of what was happening. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "you are making a mistake. You don't realize it now, but you will." The officers ignored him. One of them reached for his radio, whispering something quickly into it. The man didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. More officers would likely be on their way. More cars, more lights, more spectacle. All because he was a man trying to enter his own home. Inside, he felt the sting of humiliation. Not for himself, but for the situation. For the fact that this was still happening in a world where people were supposed to be judged by their actions, not by assumptions. He thought of the thousands of men and women who had stood in his shoes before questioned, doubted, treated as if their truth had no value. He thought of how easily these moments could spiral out of control. Yet even in that reflection, his calm did not falter. He knew who he was. He knew the authority he carried. He knew that in just a short while, when the truth came to light, everything would shift. But until then, he would let the officers dig themselves deeper into their own assumptions. "Sir," one officer said harshly, "if you don't show us your ID right now, we'll have no choice but to detain you." The man tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with quiet eyes. "Detain me? For walking into my own home?" The officer didn't answer. He simply clenched his jaw, as though his silence was stronger than admitting the absurdity of his own threat. The man let a small breath escape. He thought of the irony again. He was a man who gave orders to some of the highest law enforcement agents in the nation. His decisions shaped investigations, his voice carried authority across states. Yet here, on this sidewalk, none of that mattered. To these officers, he was just another man they didn't believe belonged where he stood. The crowd grew larger now. Someone whispered, "Isn't that his house? I've seen him here before." Another voice answered, "Yeah, he lives there." "What are they doing?" The murmurs grew, but the officers didn't turn to listen. Their focus stayed locked on him, their tone firm, their posture rigid. The man slowly set his briefcase down on the ground. Not out of fear, but to show he had nothing to hide. His hands were visible, his movements calm, his face steady. "You want to see my ID," he said finally, his voice carrying both patience and quiet strength. "You'll see it. But when you do, I hope you realize the mistake you've made here tonight." For a moment, the officers hesitated. Their confidence flickered just slightly, like a flame in the wind. But still, they didn't back down. They couldn't. To step back now would mean admitting they had judged too quickly, acted too harshly, assumed too much. The man reached into his jacket pocket slowly, carefully, making sure every motion was visible. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching, the neighbors, the cameras, the officers. Every second felt stretched, heavy, and thick with tension. He knew the truth was only a moment away from being revealed. And when it came, this entire night would change not just for him, but for the officers, for the neighbors, and for anyone who would later watch the videos that were now quietly capturing history on this quiet street. But for now, the officers still stood tall, still believed their judgment was right, still carried the illusion of control. They didn't yet know how much their world was about to shift. And the man, calm as ever, let the silence linger for just a moment longer, letting them hold on to their false certainty before reality shattered it in front of their very eyes. The man's fingers brushed the edge of his wallet as he slowly pulled it out of his jacket. Every move was steady, deliberate, and calm. He knew the weight of this moment. He knew how quickly assumptions could twist into dangerous outcomes. That was why he took his time, not because he was afraid, but because he understood the importance of clarity. His calmness was his shield, his patience, his strength. The officers kept their hands near their belts, eyes sharp, bodies tense. They leaned forward slightly, as though expecting him to pull out something other than what he had promised. Their suspicion was written across their faces. They didn't see a man returning home, they saw a threat that existed only in their own minds. When he finally opened his wallet and slid out his identification, he held it between two fingers, extending it toward them without a trace of nervousness. His expression remained neutral, almost serene, though deep inside he felt the heaviness of disappointment. He had faced many challenges in his career, but there was something uniquely painful about being doubted in the very place that should have brought comfort. The taller officer snatched the ID quickly, his eyes scanning it without much care at first. He expected a simple driver's license, perhaps with an address that wouldn't match, confirming his suspicion. But then, as his eyes moved across the card, the lines on his forehead shifted. His brow furrowed, and his mouth parted slightly as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His partner noticed the sudden change in expression. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. The taller officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he read the name again and again, his lips moving silently. Finally, he handed the card to his partner, his hand trembling just slightly. The second officer looked down, expecting to laugh at whatever had surprised his partner. But the moment his eyes fell on the name and the title printed beneath it, the color drained from his face. His breath caught, and he looked up at the man standing calmly before him with a mixture of disbelief and sudden fear. The crowd around them leaned in closer, though they couldn't yet see the card. They could feel the change in the air, though. The arrogance that had been wrapped around the officers like armor was slipping away. The man stood silently, his arms crossed loosely, his posture tall but relaxed. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smirking, he was simply waiting. He had known this moment would come, that the truth would reveal itself. And now, watching the officers struggle with their realization, he felt no need to say anything. Silence was enough. The taller officer cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. He stammered, his eyes darting to the neighbors who were still recording. This can't be right." But it was right. The identification card clearly stated his name, his position, his authority. He wasn't just any citizen defending his home. He wasn't just any man accused of trespassing. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the leader of the very agency that trained, guided, and sometimes even disciplined officers like the ones standing in front of him. The second officer swallowed hard, his confidence slipping further with every passing second. "Sir," he said, his tone suddenly softer, "we didn't realize." The man raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, you didn't realize," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of truth that could not be ignored. "And that is the problem." The crowd's whispers grew louder now. Shock, disbelief, and even a touch of satisfaction filled the air. Neighbors who had watched the man come and go countless times were now seeing the officer's mistake unfold right before their eyes. The recordings captured not only the confrontation but also the exact moment when arrogance turned into shame. The taller officer looked down at the ID once more, as though hoping it would change, hoping he had misread it. But the words didn't shift, the truth didn't bend. The title was there, bold and undeniable. "Director," he began, but his voice trailed off. He didn't know what to say. How could he apologize for accusing the head of the FBI of trespassing on his own property? The man finally spoke again, his tone still measured. "You came here with assumptions," he said softly, yet every word carried power. "You didn't listen. You didn't observe. You judged first and asked questions later. And now you see the result of that." The second officer's hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. The cameras capturing every angle made it worse. He knew that whatever he said now could follow him far beyond this neighborhood. The man took a slow step forward, not in aggression, but in presence. His eyes locked with theirs, calm but steady, unblinking. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly. Neither officer answered. Their silence was answer enough. The man let the moment hang heavy in the air. He wanted them to feel the weight of it, not just for the mistake they had made with him, but for every moment they had treated someone else unfairly, someone without the power to make the truth undeniable. He took back his identification card slowly, tucking it into his wallet with the same care he had shown when he handed it over. The crowd grew quieter, waiting, sensing that what came next would matter. "You're fortunate tonight," he said at last, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Fortunate that I am who I am. Fortunate that this moment will not end in the way so many others have. But do not mistake that for an excuse. What you've done here is not just about me, it's about the way you see people, the way you assume, the way you act without proof." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his face pale under the street light. "Sir, we made a mistake," he admitted weakly. The man nodded once. "Yes. You did." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. His calmness was stronger than anger, his presence heavier than rage. And in that moment, both officers realized the true depth of their error. The neighbors' phones continued recording, capturing not only the scene but also the quiet dignity of the man who had been treated as less than what he was. They would replay this moment, share it, spread it. And the world would see. As the man finally picked up his briefcase again, he looked at the officers one last time. "Think about this," he said softly. "Think about how easily it could have ended differently. And then ask yourselves why." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers had no answer, no defense, no words strong enough to cover their mistake. And the man, calm and steady, turned toward his home, leaving them standing in the weight of their own choices, the truth burning brighter than any badge they wore. The street was no longer quiet. The tension that had been building now shifted into shock. The neighbors whispered to one another, some with disbelief, others with excitement, and still more with outrage. The phones held up by steady hands captured every second, ensuring that nothing from this night could be hidden or erased. The two officers, once confident and forceful, now stood awkwardly under the glow of the streetlight, their authority shaken, their pride wounded. The taller officer cleared his throat, his face pale and drawn. "Sir, we didn't know." "If we had known," the man raised a hand slowly, cutting him off without raising his voice. "That's the point. You didn't know. And you acted anyway." His calm tone pierced through them far more effectively than anger ever could. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't waving his hands or threatening consequences. Instead, he stood tall, with quiet dignity, forcing them to face the truth of their actions. The shorter officer shifted nervously, glancing at the growing crowd. "Sir, please understand," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "We were just responding to reports." "We thought you thought wrong," the man interrupted smoothly. His eyes were sharp, but his expression remained composed. "You thought wrong because you assumed. You thought wrong because you saw what you wanted to see, not what was in front of you." The taller officer looked at the ground, ashamed. He had dealt with many difficult encounters in his career, but none had ever left him feeling so small. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier with every second that passed. The man glanced at the cameras around him. He knew this moment was not just about the officers. It was larger than them, larger than this neighborhood, larger than the silence of this evening. It was about a system, about judgment, about the choices people made when they looked at someone and saw only what they feared. "You don't know how lucky you are tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying across the street. "Lucky that I am patient. Lucky that I didn't respond the way you expected. Lucky that this didn't turn into another headline of tragedy." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The crowd was silent now, captivated by the quiet authority in his tone. The shorter officer took a step forward, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir, we're sorry. Truly. We didn't mean you didn't mean," the man repeated, his voice still calm. "But your actions meant everything. To me, to this neighborhood, to everyone watching. Intentions don't erase impact." The apology faded in the officer's throat. He knew there was no way to undo what had been done. The man adjusted his briefcase in his hand and looked at them both. "You wear the uniform. You carry the badge. That means your words and actions are supposed to protect, not harm. But tonight, you forgot that. Tonight, you let assumptions guide you. And that should never happen." The taller officer finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Sir, we'll file a report. We'll take responsibility." The man studied him carefully. "A report won't erase this moment. But maybe it can remind you that every decision has weight. Maybe it will remind you that the people you stop, the people you question, they are human beings before anything else. That is your duty. Never forget it." The neighbors murmured in agreement, their whispers rising into soft applause. The officers looked more uncomfortable with the clapping than with the confrontation itself. Their faces flushed as they realized how fully they had lost control of the scene. The man took a slow breath, grounding himself once again. He wasn't here to humiliate them. He wasn't here to destroy their careers. He was here to teach, to remind, to make sure that this night carried meaning beyond embarrassment. "You wanted to see my ID," he said, his voice steady. "You wanted proof of who I was. Now you have it. But tell me, what if I were not the director of the FBI? What if I were just another man, tired after work, trying to walk into his own home? Would you have listened then? Would you have apologized then? Or would this night have ended very differently?" The officers swallowed hard, their silence betraying the answer they didn't dare speak aloud. "That is what you must think about," the man continued. "Not just tonight, not just with me. Every day, every encounter. Because the people you meet don't carry titles on their foreheads. They carry lives, families, dreams, fears. And it is your job to protect that, not to threaten it." The taller officer nodded slowly, his eyes glassy with a mix of shame and realization. The shorter one couldn't meet the man's gaze at all, staring instead at the ground as if it could swallow him whole. The man turned his eyes briefly to the crowd. He could see their expressions. Some were proud of his composure, others were angry at the injustice, and many were simply stunned. He gave them a small nod, a silent reassurance that he was fine, that the truth was enough. The officers fumbled for words again, but none came. They had no defense, no explanation, nothing strong enough to cover the hole they had dug. Their voices, once loud and demanding, were now reduced to whispers of apology that even they knew carried no weight. The man stepped closer, not aggressively but firmly, his presence commanding without effort. "You should go," he said quietly. "And before you put your hands on anyone else, think about tonight. Think about what assumptions cost you, and what they could cost someone else." The officers hesitated, but then, slowly, they began to back away. Their steps were unsteady, their shoulders heavy. The crowd parted to let them pass, their eyes following every movement. The flashing lights of their patrol car painted the street in red and blue as they climbed inside, their silence louder than any siren. The man stood still, watching them leave. His heart was calm, though his mind was filled with thought. He knew this moment would not end here. The videos would spread. The story would travel. And the lesson would carry far beyond this block. As the patrol car pulled away, a neighbor stepped forward, lowering her phone. "We've got your back," she said softly. Others nodded, their faces filled with respect. The man gave a small, grateful smile. He didn't need their support, but he appreciated it. Their presence reminded him that truth was always stronger when shared. Turning back toward his home, he felt the weight of the evening settle on his shoulders. But it wasn't a burden, it was a responsibility. He knew he could take this moment and turn it into something larger, something meaningful. The humiliation the officers had tried to place on him had turned instead into a chance for reflection, for reform, for truth. As he unlocked his front door and stepped inside, he looked back once more at the street, now quiet again. The neighbors were dispersing, the air was cooling, and the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavier, fuller, carrying the memory of what had just happened. The man closed the door gently behind him, set down his briefcase, and loosened his tie. He knew tomorrow, the world would know this story. And when it did, it would carry not just embarrassment for the officers, but a lesson for everyone who had ever judged too quickly, assumed too easily, or forgotten that justice begins with fairness. The night passed slowly, and by the time morning light broke through his curtains, the man already knew the story was no longer his alone. The videos had spread. The neighbors who had recorded quietly on their phones uploaded them online, and the scenes traveled across screens and cities faster than words could. The moment when the officers demanded to know what he was doing at his own home, the moment their faces fell as they realized who he was, and the calm strength in his response, all of it was now in the public eye. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching clips on his phone. The comments poured in beneath each video: shock, outrage, support, disbelief. People across the country were talking about what had happened on that quiet street. Some were angry that even a man of his position, with all his authority, had been treated with such doubt. Others were moved by his calm, his patience, his refusal to let anger control him. And many saw the lesson shining through: if this could happen to the director of the FBI, then what about those without titles, without recognition, without power? The phone on the counter buzzed non-stop with calls and messages. Journalists wanted interviews. Officials wanted statements. His colleagues from across agencies reached out, some embarrassed, some supportive, all eager to know what he would do next. But for now, he didn't rush. He finished his coffee slowly, his mind calm. He had been through storms before. He knew the importance of choosing his words carefully. By the afternoon, he stood before cameras, not as a man wronged, but as a leader with something important to say. His posture was straight, his voice steady, his eyes clear. Reporters crowded the room, microphones stretched forward, flashes of cameras filling the air. The world was ready to hear his response. He began not with anger, not with blame, but with truth. What happened last night, he said evenly, was more than just a mistake. It was a reflection of how easily judgment can replace fairness, how quickly assumptions can replace facts. I was stopped outside my own home. I was questioned as if I did not belong. And I was accused of trespassing on property that has been mine for years. A murmur rippled through the room as cameras clicked rapidly. He let the words sink in before continuing. But this is not about me, he added. Because I hold a title. I have authority. I have the ability to defend myself in ways that many others do not. The truth is, what happened to me happens to countless men and women across this country, every single day, without cameras, without witnesses, and without the chance for their stories to be heard. The silence in the room grew heavier. Every reporter, every official, every person watching from their screens at home leaned in closer. This is about fairness, he continued. This is about judgment. This is about the responsibility of those who wear the uniform to see people as people first, not as threats, not as suspects, not as trespassers in their own lives. The badge is meant to protect, not to intimidate. The oath is meant to serve, not to assume. And when we forget that, when we let assumptions guide us, the cost is too high. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Some of the reporters lowered their pens, lost in the gravity of his words. What I want, he said, his voice firmer now, is not punishment. Not revenge. I want reflection. I want reform. I want training that teaches patience, observation, and respect. I want accountability that reminds every officer that their power is matched only by their responsibility. And I want the country to see this incident not as an embarrassment for a few, but as a chance for all of us to do better. Applause broke out softly from the back of the room, not from journalists, but from staff and citizens who had been invited to listen. He did not smile, but a calm warmth crossed his face. He had seen too much in his life to believe change would come overnight. But he believed in seeds, in planting them, in letting them grow slowly into something stronger. The next days brought waves of reaction. News channels played the videos on repeat. Debates filled living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. Commentators argued, communities discussed, families reflected. Some defended the officers, saying they were simply doing their job. But many more understood the deeper truth that their job was not to assume guilt, but to protect innocence until proven otherwise. The man continued his work at the bureau, but now with an even sharper focus. He ordered reviews of training programs, pushing for stronger lessons on bias, judgment, and respect. He called for open forums between officers and communities, where voices could be heard, stories could be shared, and trust could be rebuilt. He did not do this to make headlines. He did it because he knew leadership meant turning personal pain into public progress. In the neighborhood where it all began, life slowly returned to normal. The patrol car no longer lingered on that street, the porch lights returned to their quiet glow, and children once again rode their bicycles without worry. But for those who had been there that night, the memory stayed. They had seen how quickly assumptions could spark conflict. They had seen how dignity could calm chaos. And they had seen how truth could turn humiliation into a lesson for all. The officers who had stopped him were not forgotten. They faced inquiries, reports, and long discussions with their superiors. They carried the shame of their mistake, but also the rare chance to learn from it in a way that could change how they served in the future. Whether they would take that chance or not was up to them, but the lesson had been planted deep. The man himself never boasted about what had happened. He never used it to build his reputation higher. He didn't need to. His strength had been in his composure, in the calm way he had let the truth reveal itself. And that was what people remembered most, not the fear, not the confrontation, but the dignity with which he carried himself when faced with unfairness. Weeks later, as he walked through his neighborhood again, neighbors greeted him with warm smiles and waves. Some stopped to thank him for his example. A few even admitted that they had learned something important that night, something they would carry with them. He listened with gratitude, never making the moment about himself, but always about the larger lesson. For him, the story was not about a single night on his front lawn. It was about every night when someone, somewhere, felt questioned in their own skin, in their own space, in their own life. It was about turning one confrontation into a chance for reflection that could reach far beyond one street, one city, or one man. And as he walked back into his home, setting down his briefcase once again, he carried with him a quiet certainty. He knew change would not come quickly, but he also knew it could not come at all unless people faced the truth. That truth had been laid bare for the world to see, and now it was up to everyone, officers, citizens, leaders, neighbors, to decide what they would do with it. In the end, the man did not see himself as a victim of the night. He saw himself as a witness to what was broken and as a messenger of what needed to be fixed. His story was not just his own anymore. It belonged to the country, to the communities that needed healing, and to the future that demanded something better. The house was quiet, the evening sun settling low once again. He stood at his window, looking out at the calm street. To anyone passing by, it was just another peaceful neighborhood at dusk. But to him, it was a reminder. A reminder of what had happened, a reminder of what was at stake, and a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary lessons can unfold. And with that thought, he turned away from the window, ready to continue his work, knowing that sometimes the most powerful change begins not in conference rooms or official offices, but in the unexpected moments when truth collides with assumption and dignity turns it into something the world cannot ignore.